If I look a little perky, it's because I have a plan. This launches the first anniversary of Friday Lives, and the new year of these recordings has now begun, or is the turnaround day. And what I am looking at here is arguably my favorite book. And that's saying a lot for me. And I'm sure many other titles just suddenly clamored in my mind to, remind me of their claim to this, this place. However, this one wins. And it is a book that has an interesting physical history for me in terms of when I found it and all sorts of things like that. And I will provide all such detail, perhaps some commentary as well, context, and so on. But for this particular day, I'm not going to explain anything. And we will simply read this book chapter by chapter. And I don't know if that violates any amount of IP, this or that, but I don't care because this is a great, great novel. And I have never heard anyone talk about it, actually, with one very, very rare exception. Very few people I know have heard of it, and it simply needs to be brought to light. And here and now, this year is when I do it. I will be reading a chapter a week and commenting a bit, this or that, as I see fit, as I go. So the name of the book is Anyone Got a Match? With a question mark. Right there. It is by Max Schulman, and it was published in September of 1964, of all times that could possibly have seen it published. And it is proceeding as follows. Chapter 1. Never mind what they will tell you on Madison Avenue. It was not one of those thin-lapelled Ivy League copywriters who composed the immortal jingle. Oh, they will wink and look wise, but do not be deceived. It was not one of them. It was Jefferson Tatum himself. Yes, Jefferson Tatum, who came barefoot off a burley patch at the age of 12 and worked and gouged and scrabbled and finally built the great Tatum Cigarette Company with his own two calloused hands, who caused people the world over to step up to tobacco counters and ask for Tatums as often as they ask for Camels or Marlboros. Jefferson Tatum, unlettered and unschooled, who was magically touched by the muse in his office late one night and wrote the jingle, he himself, on the back of a bill of lading. Tatum smoke mild, like an innocent child. Land's sake, said the late Mrs. Tatum to Jefferson when he brought the jingle home. However did you think of it? Love, he replied simply. Well, there it is. Nobody ever loved the cigarette business as Jefferson Tatum did. Not Buck Duke, not R.J. Reynolds, not Pierre Lorillard. Nobody. And hence the jingle. If love can make the world go round, why can it not make a poet of a hard-fisted brawler like Jefferson? A brawler he is and always was. To illustrate, take what happened in the town of Owens Mill, headquarters and home of the Tatum Cigarette Company, on last March 24th. It was the date of Jefferson's 75th birthday, but he was far from festive. For one thing, he was cutting a wisdom tooth. For another, he had a thrombosed hemorrhoid. For still another, and this was the most painful of all, the annual fiscal statement of the Tatum Cigarette Company issued that day showed sales running a full 3% behind the previous year. But age and distress notwithstanding, Jefferson arrived at his desk at his usual of 7 a.m. and put in his customary 12 hours of work. And then later at the birthday party the employees gave him in the company cafeteria, he drank an entire mason jar of white mule and danced the two-step with every lady worker present, bar none. And then he hand-wrestled the shredding room foreman, Will Watson, a 235-pound Negro who almost went the distance in the Golden Gloves a few years ago. Then Jefferson cut his birthday cake and ate a chunk the size of your head, and then went home with Millie and Esther McCabe, the twins from packaging. True, he only made it with Millie, but even so, 75 years old. And after such a night, he arose before dawn the next day. It was a Saturday, and set out with Virgil, his son, to climb the ridge and have another try at old Slewfoot, a large and cunning black bear which Jefferson hated as Ahab had hated the whale. For 12 full years, Jefferson had stalked old Slewfoot without so much as one clean shot, but this year he felt it was going to be different. He felt it in his bones. Jefferson and Virgil, guns ready to hand, squatted about 100 yards from a cave sunk in the wooded hill. He's in there, I know it, Jefferson said to Virgil. That's got to be where he winters. I figured it out. And I figured out something else. He always comes out exactly the same time, just 3 days after the Sweet William buds. And that's today, boy. I've been keeping track. You watch. You watch. Before you know it, he'll drag himself out of there, blinking and yawning and rubbing his old pelt on them rocks. And then I get him. Then. Yes, said Virgil mildly. I hate to mention it, but the bear hunting season isn't open. Don't I know that? Snapped Jefferson. Ain't I the game warden? Virgil smiled. Yes, Pa, he said. Virgil was 43 years old, a large, rugged man, yet scholarly in appearance. He had a gimpy leg, the result of another bear hunt long ago, but the limp was so slight that a stranger would fail to notice it. The old man suddenly grabbed Virgil's arm. There was a stirring in the cave, dim but definite. I told you, didn't I? Whispered Jefferson. He raised his gun and waited. And while he waited, spring betrayed him. Without warning, a north wind howled over the ridge, and thick white flakes of snow came pelting down. Inside the cave, for Jefferson had rightly diagnosed the bear's whereabouts, old Slewfoot opened up one gummy eye, regarded the snow, and decided to resume his long winter's nap. Jefferson cussed, and it was a thing to hear because Jefferson, by common consent, was one of the 3 or 4 truly great cussers of the border South. He could cuss lengthily, pithily, chromatically, and even creatively. He did not, however, cuss often. Knowing the awesome power of his profanity, he saved it for occasions when it was unquestionably indicated, like when a black bear refused to come out and be killed, or when some fool suggested cigarettes could cause lung cancer. Virgil laid a soothing hand on his father. Let's go to the lodge, Pa, he said. Nobody will be there yet. A half-hour's climb to the top of the ridge brought them to the Tatum Hunting Lodge, or as people insisted on calling it, the Owens Hunting Lodge. The Owens family, founders and gentry of Owens Mill, had in fact built the lodge originally, but along with everything else in Owens Mill, the lodge had eventually accrued to Jefferson. Still, habit dies hard, and people, including the surviving Owenses, continued to think of it as the Owens Hunting Lodge. It was a big, handsome, comfortably furnished place, commanding a magnificent view of the valley below. In the beginning, there had been only a single building, 60 feet by 30, made of varnished logs and fieldstone. Now this structure was surrounded by a colony of small cabins, rude but not without plumbing and inner spring mattresses. Every weekend, a group of Owenses, plus guests, arrived to enjoy a healthful 2 days of alcohol and sex. The drinking was done in the main lodge. The other was accomplished in the cabins, generally in pairs. Regarding the Owens family, Jefferson had curiously mixed feelings, loathing and respect. The ratio was roughly 96% loathing and 4% respect. He hated them for their spanking new Abercrombie and Fitch woodsman's outfits, for their costly and unfired guns, for their Princeton educations, for the outlandish guests they brought to the lodge, many of them Yankees and some almost certainly Jews. But mostly, Jefferson hated the Owenses because they were rich, and it was all his fault. In the early precarious years of the Tatum Cigarette Company, Jefferson had had to borrow heavily to stay in business. And in Owens Mill, nobody had had money to lend except the Owenses. As a financial risk, Jefferson had been spectacularly unsafe, but as a borrower, he had been a veritable Demosthenes. The Owenses, spellbound, had granted the loans and accepted stock in the Tatum Cigarette Company as security. When Jefferson had defaulted, and he could do no other in those first bruising years, the Owenses willy-nilly had wound up owning big blocks of Tatum stock, per value $1. Today, after 3 splits, the stock stood at $96.50, and the Owenses, to Jefferson's everlasting chagrin, were all rich. They were not as rich as Jefferson. Even in his worst days, Jefferson had taken care to keep control of his company, but they were rich nonetheless. Yet, in spite of all his grousing at the Owenses, Jefferson retained a sneaky respect for them. He could never quite forget that he was a backwoods boy of uncertain lineage, while they were what the South calls quality. So he made them executives of his company, naturally in posts where they could do no harm, and he allowed them to gamble each weekend at his lodge. It was only 10 o'clock in the morning when Virgil and Jefferson reached the lodge, and as Virgil had predicted, the Owenses had not yet arrived. Jefferson sank into a big leather chair. Virgil touched a match to the logs in the fireplace, fetched the Jack Daniels, a pitcher of water, and 2 glasses. He poured 3 fingers for his father, 2 for himself, and added a finger of water to each. Then he sat down across from Jefferson, filled a pipe, and lit it. "Do you have to smoke a goddamn pipe?" said Jefferson irritably. "I happen to make cigarettes, remember?" Virgil grinned and puffed. "You're a disappointment to me, boy," said Jefferson. "You've always been." "Drink your drink, Pa," said Virgil. Jefferson sipped, but his melancholy did not abate. "Disappointments," he said lugubriously. "That's all life is, disappointments. There's you, there's old Slewfoot, there's that last statement of the cigarette company with sales down 3% in a single year. There's them panty-waist Owenses with their lifted binkies. There's my wisdom tooth in my piles. Disappointments, disappointments. And yet folks are all the time saying that Jefferson Tatum, man, has he got the world by the short hairs. Ha! That's all they know about it. What have I got, boy? Will you please tell me?" "Yes, sir," said Virgil. "You've got $80 or $90 million. You've got the biggest cigarette plant in the world. You've got the town of Owens Mill and everything in it. You've got 2 churches, 1 cemetery, 1 public park, 1 country club, 1 hunting preserve, 1 skyscraper, 1—" "You damn right, boy," interrupted the old man, banging down his glass. "And nobody gave me 1 stick of it. I made it all. Me, all alone. Me." He leaped to his feet, waving a finger, but before he could begin to declaim, Virgil rose quickly. "Pa, if you're about to do the speech about how you came to Owens Mill barefoot and fought your way to the top, and let me make it clear, sir, I do enjoy this speech thoroughly. I mean, it's right up there with Mark Antony and Patrick Henry and Lincoln's second inaugural. All I'm saying is if you're going to do that particular address, you always get terrible thirsty, it being so long at all. So how about if I fix a drink first?" "I have nursed a viper in my bosom," said Jefferson with a resentful glare at Virgil. But the glare abruptly turned to a laugh, and the father embraced the son and clapped his back with hard, noisy, painful thumps to prove that the emotions flooding his breast were not heaven forfend less than manly. Jefferson, a shameless melodramatist, complained loud and often of the many disappointments in his life, but the truth is he had only one, Virgil. Everything else had broken Jefferson's way, not easily but ultimately. There had been hungry years in the beginning, precarious years of battling the tobacco trust, but he had prevailed. He had seen his Tatum cigarette zoom to the top and stay there. He had, against all counsel, courted and won Miss Hallie Owens, a genuine Owens of Owens Mill. The acquisition of Miss Hallie, it must be said, was not an unflawed triumph. She was a bustly, cheery, gossipy, homey little creature, a compulsive preserver of preserves and quilter of quilts, who bored Jefferson almost to the point of shrieking. Still, she was an Owens, and she did bring forth a fine, intelligent son, and she had had the grace to die quickly and young. Viewed judiciously, she could not, on balance, be called a disappointment. No, the sole clear disappointment was Virgil, an only son, strong, smart, determined, a son on whom Jefferson lavished all the pent-up, unused, untapped, and even unsuspected love within his heart, and who, to his turn, repaid Jefferson's love in the same honest coin. Such a son, such a logical successor to the stewardship of the Tatum Cigarette Company and to the personal barony Jefferson had made of Owens Mill, such a gratifying, satisfying, totally qualified heir, said no. Virgil had nothing against the cigarette business, but he just did not want to be in it. Nor did he want to own the town of Owens Mill. He wanted, and this stabbed Jefferson like a knife, to devote his life to the pursuit of learning. Where do you get such nutty ideas? Jefferson had yelled when Virgil, then aged 18, had first announced the dread news. Not from me, that's for sure, and not from your mother up there making piccalilli with the angels. So where? I don't know, Pa, Virgil had replied. I've always liked books and plays and school and stuff like that. I don't understand, Jefferson had said, honestly bewildered. I know you're not a pansy, not the way you're leaving pecker tracks all over town. I know you're in a fist fight behind the drugstore at least once a week, gimpy leg and all. I've seen you hunting fish. I just don't understand. Well, maybe you will someday. Now, Pa, if you'll excuse me, I've got to pack. Where do you think you're going? I haven't quite decided. Harvard, maybe, or else Yale. Like hell, Jefferson had thundered. If your hard head is set on college, which I will never understand, you'll damn well go to Acanthus. Like any other tobacco tycoon, Jefferson naturally owned a college. It was a denominational school, staffed by elders of the Don't Fiddle with the Gospel Brotherhood, and the campus was located right in Owens Mill where Jefferson could keep a watchful eye on it. Aw, Pa, Virgil had groaned. Aw, balls, Jefferson had retorted. It ain't going to be all your way, boy. If I give, you give. You won't go into the business? Okay, I guess I got to accept it even if it breaks my heart. But you're not running away and leaving me here alone. You're my family, boy, my only family. What's the matter with you? Don't blood count for nothing? To this argument, there was no answer, so Virgil had enrolled in Acanthus College. And today, 25 years later, as he sat with his father before the fire in the hunting lodge, Virgil was still at Acanthus. He was, of course, no longer a student. He was, in fact, president of the college, having advanced in 2.5 decades from undergraduate to teacher, to dean, to provost, and finally to prexy. Here, let me freshen your drink, Pa, Virgil was saying. The old man shook his head morosely. Virgil shrugged. All right, you want to pout? Go ahead and pout. Ain't I got a right to? Demanded Jefferson. Ain't I got miseries enough? Cigarette sales down 3% in one single year? So what? Tatum's are still the leading brand in the country. That ain't the point, cried Jefferson in a righteous rage. Point is that so-called Surgeon General is scaring people off cigarettes, and it's getting worse all the time. You'll handle it, said Virgil lightly. Yeah? How? I've been studying this thing day and night, and I swear I don't know how to stop it. Don't fret, Pa, you'll find a way. When? Maybe after your nap, said Virgil. Naps, cried Jefferson incredulously. Are you unhinged, boy? Do you imagine I could sleep with all this trouble on my mind? Try, urged Virgil. Won't do no good, declared Jefferson. Nevertheless, he walked into the bedroom, removed his boots, stretched out, closed his eyes, and fell asleep. Elapsed time, 31 seconds. Virgil, meanwhile, made ready for the arrival of the Owenses and their guests. It was a fairly involved procedure. For example, preparing the bar was not a simple matter of setting out bourbon and branch water, as might be assumed from this rustic southern locale. One of the Owenses wintered in Italy and drank nothing but Strega. Another summered in France, and for him, Virgil had to break out a bottle of Ameripicon. A third lived half the year in Galway and required numerous bottles of stout, room temperature. After he finished at the bar, Virgil went to the piano and rummaged through the sheet music in the bench. Late or soon, the Owenses always got musical. First in their recitals, came nostalgic tunes of the 1930s. These were followed by traditional airs in the manner of Joan Baez. Then, as the alcohol began to take hold, they switched to Ivy League hymns. Finally, good and gassed, they finished with Confederate marches. Virgil chose a substantial number in each category and arranged them in order on the piano desk. As he headed for the kitchen to make a selection of hors d'oeuvres, Virgil heard a groaning from Jefferson's bedroom. He opened the door and looked in. The old man was threshing and rolling in his sleep. Disappointments, he kept mumbling. Disappointments. Virgil closed the door and smiled wryly. He thinks he's got disappointments, he said to himself, and continued toward the kitchen. Virgil was a man who shunned self-pity as unproductive and unvirile. Yet being human, he could not avoid it altogether. Now, as he prowled the kitchen, gathering cheeses and biscuits, he allowed himself one of his infrequent lapses. Yes, he thought, embracing dolor, I know a thing or two about disappointments. He did. There was the death of his mother when Virgil had been 12. There was the gimpy leg caused by one swipe of a black bear's paw when Virgil had been 15. And there was Acanthus College when Virgil had been 18, and today, with Virgil 43 years old, there was still Acanthus College. Acanthus was a small place, only 1,200 students, but it was renowned throughout the nation for two reasons. First, because credits and degrees earned at Acanthus were recognized by no other American college, and second, because the Acanthus football team had not lost a game since 19 Myers, called 19 because that was the size of his collar, took over as head coach. There were other noteworthy aspects of Acanthus College. For example, it led the entire country in the age of its faculty, the weight of its undergraduates, and the slenderness of its catalog. For further example, the largest building on the Acanthus campus, a neo-Gothic edifice with 2 spires and 3 stained glass windows, was not, as a visitor might suppose, the chapel. It was the residence of 19 Myers. The 3 stained glass windows, made in Augsburg, depicted the wing T formation, pass interference, and the red dog. Virgil had depicted the wing T formation, pass interference, and the red dog. Virgil had been only 23 years old when he assumed his instructor's duties at Acanthus, and being only 23, he was full of burning zeal to raise the level of scholarship. The burning zeal underwent an instant hosing upon encountering 19 Myers' book-proof athletes. He could not teach them, nor could he expel them because they were protected by 19, who was in turn protected by Jefferson. Nor could Virgil leave town because he was the only family Jefferson had, as Jefferson never tired of reminding him. Nor could Virgil quit his job because he had chosen to devote his life in learning, and in Owens Mill, Acanthus College, save the mark, was it. So Virgil stayed, and as his aged colleagues on the faculty were called row on row to Abraham's bosom, Virgil perforce climbed up the academic ladder. It was not Jefferson's influence that raised Virgil from instructor to prexy with such rapidity. It was a simple failure of geriatrics. Through all his tenure at Acanthus, Virgil never stopped making sorties against the minds of the undergraduates. His record of failure was perfect. But even now, as he stood in the kitchen of the hunting lodge, loading a platter with camembert, oca, brie, and Huntley and Palmer's export assortment, he still nursed a tiny, faint, flickering hope that somehow, someday, he would pry loose the brute grip of 19 Myers and turn Acanthus into a sure enough temple of higher education. He carried the cheese and crackers into the living room, placed them on a coffee table, and sat down to resume riffling through the tragedies in his life. Abruptly, he stopped. That, he said sternly to himself, will be enough of that. Self-pity begets self-pity, and it was definitely not Virgil's line of work. Resolutely, he put misfortune out of his mind and picked up a volume of James Conant. Getting dark in here. James Conant. After a moment, he laid the book aside. As long as he was doing a census of his traumas, he thought he might as well do it properly. He had not yet touched the biggest setback of all, the crowning disappointment in a career of disappointments, the lady known as Boo. Boo was the great and only love of Virgil's life. Naturally, with his kind of luck, she did not love him back. She was called Boo because she had been born Barbara Ogilvy Owens, a member of the Owens family and vaguely a second cousin to Virgil on his mother's side. It was not, however, consanguinity that made Boo reject Virgil. She just plain did not want him. For a long time, the feeling had been mutual. Boo was a few years younger than Virgil, and as children in this family-minded community, they had, of course, seen one another often. Virgil had not then regarded her as a love object. He, in fact, had thought of her more as a jockey. She owned a horse from whose back she would descend only at bedtime. Even her meals were taken in the saddle. When she forgot to bring along a sandwich, she simply grazed with the horse. To the undisguised relief of her immediate and distant kin, she went away to school in her teens. She was spindly, pimpled, and bustless when she left. She returned transfigured, tall, slender, elegant, rounded, gracious, poised, and most importantly, dismounted. Virgil looked upon the new Boo and was instantly smitten. She, on her part, was friendly to Virgil, even cordial, but she dated him no more often than she did a dozen other eager swains of the town. Even after Pearl Harbor, When the young men of Owen's Mill enlisted wholesale, and Virgil, 4F because of his leg, had Boo all to himself, he made no perceptible progress. "I love you, Virgil," she kept saying, "but not that way." She was still saying it. But Virgil, back in those first months after Pearl Harbor, was not dismayed. He clung to the conviction that if he could keep courting Boo without competitors for just a little while longer, he would surely wear her down. It was not to be. Competitors appeared in droves around the beginning of 1943. The Army Air Force set up a base outside Owens Mill, and luckless, dauntless Virgil again became one among many. Virgil still pursued Boo, and so did an impressive number of the officers and men of the Army Air Force. But in the end, it was a rank outsider who lapped the field. The Okinawa campaign was raging in the Pacific, and news arrived that Owens Mill had its first war hero, a local attorney's son, poor but of good bloodlines, by name Gabe Fuller, and lieutenant commander in naval aviation, won a posthumous Navy Cross for knocking a kamikaze out of the skies at the cost of his own life. The town buzzed with tales of Gabe's gallantry. The town buzzed even louder when Boo made the astonishing announcement that she had quietly gone to San Francisco and married Gabe just before he sailed overseas to meet a hero's death. By way of proof, she produced a gold wedding band and a marriage license. If further proof were needed, she produced a baby boy some months later. The baby boy, Gabriel, as Boo named him, in no way dampened Virgil's ardor. "It doesn't matter about the baby," he declared. "I will cherish him and raise him as my own. Boo, listen, you just got to marry me." "I love you, Virgil," she said, "but not that way." Today, Gabriel was 18 years old, and Boo, though still a beautiful woman, was no longer a prime target for the blades of Owens Mill. Only Virgil remained constant, and no amount of discouragement could extinguish his hopes. Just as he believed he would one day infuse culture into Acanthus College, he believed that he would finally lead Boo to the altar, a stubborn man. He stirred now in the chair before the fireplace in the hunting lodge. He uttered a 4-letter word, and then he said it louder. He poured a stiff jolt of bourbon and knocked it back. At the moment, he disapproved sorely of himself, not for playing a mug's game with Boo, nor with 19 Myers either, but for letting himself wallow in so long in the slough of self-pity. Insidious, that's what it was. Habit-forming, fiber-destroying. Had blind Homer whimpered and whined, or epileptic Caesar, or stumpy Napoleon? Of course not. Well, neither would lame Virgil. Feeling better, he went to the window. The snow had stopped falling. The sky was washed bright, and on the horizon there suddenly appeared a long, white, double-rotored, banana-shaped helicopter. It approached rapidly, hovered for a moment directly overhead, whirring and beating, and then it descended to a clearing in front of the lodge. The Owenses had arrived. Shulman. To be continued.